We've reached the fifth and final instalment of my series looking at the first 5 Squeeze albums on A&M. And so we now need to look at this record. This is Sweets from a Stranger, released in May 1982. This was the second Squeeze album that I remember buying, where it was a complete surprise to me. Out shopping with my parents one day, I think probably in Chester, found it in the racks, incredibly exciting as ever. I was only 11 years old when this album came out. I was in my final year at primary school, wasn't reading the music papers, didn't really have any idea when a new Squeeze record was going to come out. And it's strange because me being in my last year at primary school, it's really relevant to this record and to this video for me. Moving from childhood into, obviously not into adulthood, but into adolescence, maybe taking that first step, moving up to a new school. When this record came out, it was May, so I was due to go up to the new school in September, and I was going from a really small little village school to a big secondary school. And what was really strange is that the music on this record changed quite a lot from Squeeze's early days. When I first got into Squeeze back in 1979, I was an 8-year-old lad, and the music was quite jolly and quite upbeat, a bit juvenile in places. They'd moved through the Argy Bargy and East Side Story records, gradually becoming more mature, Chris Difford getting a more mature lyrical outlook. And by the time they reached this record in 1982, that had gone a stage further, really. Chris was writing in a more world-weary kind of way, and the music was definitely more sophisticated. It didn't have that poppy juvenile quality anymore. They were exploring different avenues, and it just seemed like a more mature record, and it just totally chimed with me at the time. Just that idea of growing up and moving on. And of course it turned out to be the last album for a number of years. It was the breakup album, really. After this album was released, a few months later, there was a couple of tours first, but then Difford and Tilbrook disbanded the group. So that has cast a pall over this album, I think, over the years. It's come to be viewed, really, as the end of an era. It's also viewed critically, I think, in retrospect, as being a bit of a letdown after East Side Story, which I think it kind of was in a way. But by the same token, I think it's a lot better than it's given credit for, and we can talk about that as we get a bit further into the video. So we've got Glenn Tilbrook, we've got John Bentley on bass, Chris Difford, Gilson Lavis, the drummer. The new guy on the block is Don Snow, who had been in a band called the Sinceros. He was brought in to replace Paul Carrack when Paul Carrack left the band in the summer of '81 following the band's US tour. They had to draft Don Snow in very last minute, and in fact his first appearance with the band was on Top of the Pops, miming the keyboard parts to Labelled with Love, which had been from East Side Story, of course, featuring Paul Carrack. So that was his first appearance with the band. And then he joined for just this one record, although he did come back in later years. And he was classically trained, the first time that Squeeze had brought a classically trained player into the group, and he had a very nimble-fingered approach. He was almost like J.S. Bach sometimes, quite virtuosic, and he brought this just this lovely virtuosity to the keyboard parts. Some of his keyboard textures were really interesting. He had a kind of harpsichordy sound which he used on a couple of tracks, but he was also using what almost sounds like early sampling on some of the tracks, kind of voice type keyboard sounds, which I think helped bring Squeeze into the 80s a little bit. It did sound a little bit like they were heading into arena stadium territory. But by the same token, I think it lacked a little bit of character. I think what Costello and Roger Bakiran had brought to East Side Story was quite a Beatlesy, careful production sound where each track had its own distinctive identity, whereas on Sweets from a Stranger it started to sound a bit more homogenised, and Glenn Tilbrook was mainly in the producer's chair, I think, with Phil McDonald bringing up the rear maybe a little bit, and Glenn was quite headstrong, and in later years he decided that he hadn't really liked the work he'd done on the record. Glenn decided that, and I think he thought that in retrospect it would have been better if they'd got a kind of big name producer in again. Gus Dudgeon, who had been the Elton John producer, of course, and who later went on to produce XTC, he briefly came on board for this record and did a little bit of production with them, but it didn't work out at all. I think he and Glenn butted heads a number of times, and that was never going to work. So anyway, what resulted was a record that was quite different in tone, and both lyrically and musically. As I said, in terms of the music, sounding a little bit more sophisticated, synth-pop coming in, shades of blue-eyed soul coming in, courtesy of tracks like Black Coffee in Bed, and more experimental sounds, really, more studio-y experimental sounds, which I think probably took Squeeze a little bit away from their classic sound. If you think of the Argy Bargy East Side Story sound as being vintage classic Squeeze, a few experimental moments on here which I suppose are a bit left field in a way and maybe didn't work 100%, but anyway. So let's have a look. So we've got the quite nice inventive album design, the illuminated peepholes, quite a clever idea. And for once on a Squeeze album released in the UK, we actually had a lyric sheet. So here's the lyrics. You probably can't see it, but just in the background of the lyrics you can just see some faint musical instruments. And then this was a charcoal drawing which had been done by Don Snow of each of the band members. This was the official Squeeze fan club t-shirt which came out in 1982. I didn't know that until I met with my cousin Paul from Scotland when we went on holiday to Cornwall in the summer of '82, and he had the t-shirt and I was very impressed by that. There are only 2 singles from this record. Firstly, we had Black Coffee in Bed. The studio version was about 6.5 minutes. Glenn Tilbrook complained later that he felt that they'd taken the song at too sluggish a pace. It's meant to be a bit of a blue-eyed soul tune, really, but they do plod along through it a little bit, and it is quite long and extended, but it is one of Squeeze's classics, really, one of their great breakup songs. And it's lasted into the set list all these years. Featured a really nice guest vocal spot by Paul Young and Elvis Costello as well over the end part, and had quite a funny video actually where they're all caked in early 80s eyeliner. The video was directed by Steve Barron, who I think he'd worked with Michael Jackson, and the funny story about the video, which I learned subsequently when I wrote my book, I talked to John Bentley, the bass player, and he revealed, no sorry, it was John Savannah, Don Snow, who told me that the reason that they all look so wooden in the video is because they didn't realise that the camera was rolling and they thought it was just a rehearsal, and that's why they look so kind of blank and zombie-like in the video. It was, I think, Black Coffee in Bed, the single and the video, were very much a product of that kind of early 80s new wave, almost new romantic kind of sound, really. Glenn Tilbrook got some blonde highlights in his hair, they've got makeup, they're starting to get a bit of a sort of Duran Duran wannabe kind of look, you know, in some ways losing touch maybe with their rough and ready roots in some ways. B-side is The Hunt, which is a bit of a moody track, not bad. The second single from the record, which I actually have on picture disc, really nice picture disc here, was When the Hangover Strikes, which is the final song on side 1, which is a really slow, jazzy song, a kind of Frank Sinatra type song written about a guy with a hangover. Essentially, he's just shuffling about his flat, you know, making the coffee and having a shower and trying to recover from the night's drinking of the night before. Chris was writing more and more about drinking at this point, I think, as his own alcoholic tendencies maybe were starting to take root a little bit. He'd always liked to drink, but at this point he'd really started to lean in heavily on it, I think, and he was writing more and more songs about alcohol drinking. I think virtually every song on this record actually mentions alcohol or somebody drinking. But When the Hangover Strikes, a really strange choice for a single, and it absolutely bombed. Black Coffee in Bed did really badly as well. That only got into the lower reaches of the charts. But When the Hangover Strikes just absolutely vanished without trace, and it didn't really chime with what was happening in the charts at the time. You had bands like Haircut 100 who were doing this very bright, summery kind of music. It was called new pop, I think, at the time, wasn't it? And there was the sense that Squeeze, even though Squeeze was starting to really break through in America and they were starting to play some really big venues in the States, there was a kind of sense that they'd peaked, really. Anyway, we'll get to that as we get towards the end of the video, as we reach the breakup. So those are the 2 singles, both good songs. Whether they were great singles or not too sure. Black Coffee in Bed, a bit long and ponderous. And When the Hangover Strikes is, as I said, you know, a sort of Frank Sinatra-style jazz ballad about a guy with a hangover. Didn't quite chime with the pop crowds in '82. Incidentally, brilliant B-side of When the Hangover Strikes, Elephant Girl, one of Christopher's greatest lyrics, and an absolutely brilliant tune by Glenn Tilbrook. Should have been on the album, really. They recorded about 18 songs for Sweets from a Stranger, and they whittled it down to 12 songs, and I think a few of the songs that they left off the record, including that one, The Elephant Girl, really should have been on the album, because, you know, there are sort of 2 or 3 songs on this record which you could maybe describe as being a little bit subpar for Squeeze, really. I mean, you've got the opening track, Out of Touch, which sets the tone for the record, really. It's got this juddering synth part in it. It's quite hard and metallic sounding, and the lyrics are really, they just sound really world-weary. Glenn takes the lead lyric, and it's quite an embittered song. You find a hair on my jacket and you know it's not mine. You look at my pillow but you're wasting your time because I'm out of touch with you. Your smile no longer sings. I'm so out of touch with you. Now your phone forever rings. Most of the songs on the record are like this. You know, East Side Story had quite a lot of songs that were third-person narratives and little short story songs, kind of Kinksian kind of songwriting. But on Speech from a Stranger, most of the songs are written in first person. So they're almost, you might almost think it's a concept album and it's the same character in each of the songs, and it's this guy who's basically drinking all the time and running into problems in his personal life. I Can't Hold On, the second track, is quite a bombastic song, really. Probably one of the tracks that they were maybe trying to put their cards on the table in terms of wanting to be more of an arena band or perhaps even a stadium band. I rather like it. It's got a good keyboard solo in it from Don Snow. The lyric doesn't really mean that much, really. It's quite shallow lyrically, but it's good fun. It's quite a bouncy song. Points of View, the third song, is absolutely beautiful. It's a song about a guy in a nightclub who essentially is looking across a crowded bar and seeing this beautiful girl, and he really wants to talk to her, but he just doesn't feel like he has any chance at all. I'm too drunk for conversation, though I wait for invitation. She's exciting, I'm uninvited. 15 rounds, this love I fighted. I'll walk home and curse the heavens. Lost on points, our love was flattened. Maybe she had other things to do and didn't want any points of view. Quite a moving song, quite a touching song, beautiful melody, maybe again touches of Blue-Eyed Soul, really beautiful singing by Glenn. I think it's a high point on the record. Stranger Than the Stranger on the Shore is musically very interesting. It's almost got a sort of Latin feel, or maybe a Brazilian feel. There's some kind of interesting musical influences coming to bear in it. John Bentley's bass line does have a bit of a Latin feel to it, and the lyric is all about the business troubles Squeeze were having at the time. They'd been dumped by their manager, Jake Riviera, who had come aboard to manage them on East Side Story. And during this period, they were actually without any management, and they were starting to flounder a little bit because of that. And Stranger Than the Stranger on the Shore articulates that. It's a song about business problems and difficulties. I think it's quite an interesting song. I don't think the band are particularly enamoured with it over the years. They've not spoken about it very, very kindly. There's quite a funny story attached to it. Glenn had got this ocarina, which is, I'm not sure where ocarinas come from, but it's a sort of exotic musical instrument, and he'd been trying to, well, in fact he did use it on the track, but Chris Difford was totally disgusted. He didn't want it on the song at all, and they had a big row in the studio. And then Chris said that Glenn started leaving it in strategic places around the studio just to annoy him. So you know, it's quite funny, but at the same time, I think it reveals that during this period, there were some problems in the band, really. Difford and Tilbrook were properly starting to fall out with each other, I think. And there's a bit of a slightly embittered quality, I think, entered their relationship round about this point. And I suppose that's never a good thing when you're trying to create music together. Onto the Dance Floor, a bit of a nondescript song. That towards the end of side one. It's okay. It's nothing too special, really. When the Hangover Strikes, at the end of side one. Black Coffee in Bed. Start of side two. I've Returned is an interesting song. Again, it's a song about a guy who's coming home after a night on the town. He's had too much to drink, and I think he's basically calling up to the window almost. He's apologising to his wife, who I think wasn't too impressed by his behaviour the night before. Some really great lyrics on this one, actually. Last night I played the drunken fiddle, disabled love with a word of dribble, on and on about some jumbled subject. I said your friends were a bunch of muppets. I said your sister should have grown a moustache, said you didn't need to take off your mask. Down the staircase I made my stagger. I left you crying, but it didn't matter. You've thrown my jigsaw all over the floor. We're at the deepest deep. So quintessentially Chris Difford, really. And the song has an almost, I think Glenn said it had he thought it had an almost Bruce Springsteen quality to it, quite anthemic. Has this recurring chorus, this I've Returned chorus, which is a bit different for Squeeze, and it was it got into the live set for a while, and but it is very much a deep cut, I'd say. Song Like a Knife, one of my favourite Squeeze songs ever. featuring a wonderful string arrangement by Del Newman. It's very classical. It relates the story of a young guy who's drunk once again, and he's being seduced in this very upper class living room by this woman who I think she's meant to be a kind of heiress. And there's just some wonderful touches. The head of a hunt on a wall by a painting, an upright piano stood locked by the door. In through the window the light was fast fading, while I spilt my whiskey all over the floor. Making a mess of my words, I was trying to impress the Empress with my wimpy tales, fanning her face from cigar smoke and sighing. I had come close to be miles from her trail. At the time, Glenn and Chris were socialising with some aristocrats, strangely enough, courtesy of their new manager. They did finally get a new manager, a guy called David Entervan, and he was in with the Guinness family. And Chris and Glenn had a couple of nights sat in the banqueting hall at the Guinness Castle, and Chris started to let that seep into his lyrics, the idea of relationships going on behind closed doors in these very upper crust establishments, a million miles away from the stuff that he'd been writing early on, of course. But again, as I said, Chris and the band were moving into new territory on this record. Great song, I think, Tongue Like a Knife, and it ends with this beautiful jazzy outro, which borrows the tune to My Favourite Things, with a wonderful Del Newman string arrangement on that as well. Great song, really heartfelt chorus. I've always loved it. It's one of my favourite tracks. And then His House, Her Home, another absolute classic. This one is sung by Chris in the high voice that he'd used on Someone Else's Heart on East Side Story. And this is a track which is basically about a guy who's having an affair with a woman, and he's in the house with her, and her son is watching them, trying to work out what's going on. And again, it has a bit of an upper crust kind of feel to this song in terms of the lyrics. I think to myself, when we kiss, your husband is watching from his portrait. His eyes are looking down on the slipper and stocking, back against the bookcase, down upon the floor. Empty the decanter, slur again for more. I love those references to portraits on the wall and decanters. Chris's great eye for detail, I think, and it's a great song. It has a harpsichordy kind of keyboard part in it by Don Snow, which works really well. And essentially, it's about a guy, as I said, having an affair and wondering where is this going. That great chorus: his house, her home, our future in a lover's world, her son, her heart, her love for me, tomorrow's world. In the second verse, I laugh at myself when your son is watching cartoons. In the morning, he's looking up to me when we're in the bathroom. Sees me kissing mother, doesn't blink an eye. Asks a lot of questions, answers hard to find. Absolutely brilliant. The very first dance is an interesting song. The second to last song on the album, it has a strange fragmented production. It's one of the most experimental songs Squeeze ever did. It has this lovely saloon bar piano and almost a kind of vocal sample refrain in it. It's quite ahead of its time as a track, but it is quite experimental. There's not much that's classic Squeeze about it, but I do rather like it. And then the album finishes with The Elephant Ride, which is just an absolutely gorgeous, beautiful song. I think loosely based melodically on the Beatles track I'll Be Back. It starts with that major to minor guitar strumming thing which they did on that song. And this song is really a post-coital song, really. It's about two people, two lovers who wake up in the early morning and they're together, cocooned in this aura of bliss. It has this wonderful recurring refrain: today is none of our concern. And there's no chorus. It just goes through these just really beautiful three verses, really. That rewarding cigarette that burns slowly by the bed fills the room with mystery. The apple ripens on the tree. As the phone hangs by the cord, as the streets begin to fill, there's no distance anymore. There's no wanting when you will. We'll be sleeping through the day as the world around us turns. As the phone hangs by the cord, today is none of our concern. One of Glenn's favourite songs. He still plays it live to this day. When you go and see Glenn Tilbrook live, it's one of the songs that he always seems to throw into his set list. So, it just kind of strikes me going through this record how many really good songs are on it. I guess the cardinal sin which this album committed was that it wasn't East Side Story. It just wasn't really seen as being a worthy successor. It wasn't as varied, wasn't as colourful. Down in the dumps almost, I think, lyrically. It didn't, the lyrics didn't make people feel good. There was a definite sort of aura of despondency, which actually mirrored, I think, what was happening in the band at the time. They were falling apart at the seams, unfortunately, and Glenn and Chris just decided to put an end to the band. They talked themselves into the idea that Squeeze had come to an end, whereas in fact, of course, that wasn't true, but at the time they didn't really know that. So that was that. They announced a farewell tour, the Last Orders tour. There was one more single, Annie Get Your Gun, which was produced by Alan Tarney, which is a great little pop song. But Squeeze hardly played on it really. It's mainly just Glenn Tilbrook's voice overdubbed onto an Alan Tarney backing track, and it didn't do great in the charts, although it did become a very popular Squeeze song, and it did, in fact, it did survive into the set list. It's still played today, but at the time it didn't, it didn't do too well. But the ironic postscript to all this, of course, is that Squeeze then released their 45s compilation, 45s and under compilation, which became a top 10. I think it was a top 10 album, and they tried so hard to have a hit album all through these years. That was a really big record. It sold in quite big quantities in America, and really, I suppose, was the record which they came to be associated with, particularly in the States. So that was the end of the story, except of course it wasn't the end of the story, because Squeeze were to reform 3 years later in 1985, which is part 2 really, which I will be looking at some point. I will definitely launch a new series at some point and look at all those records which they made in the 80s heading into the 90s, but for now that does bring the story to a close, I'm afraid. So thanks to everybody that's enjoyed this series and has chimed in with comments and memories. I'm pleased to have got to the end of the 5th one and to have covered those 5 albums, which for me are just, absolute cornerstone records from my childhood, and they just mean so much to me. And yeah, what more can I say? God bless Squeeze. Take care. See you soon.